Welcome back to the Banking on Data podcast, powered by Lumio Solutions, where we invite experts from across the community banking and credit union industry to share best practices for enabling risk-informed business intelligence. Hello, welcome back to the Banking on Data podcast. I am excited to have a returning guest here with us today, Jeff Fink, who is the founder of Lumio Insight and is currently the Chief Product Officer at Lumio Solutions. Jeff, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for coming back.
Well, thank you for having me back. I appreciate it.
Jeff, you've been out on the conference circuit recently, talking about the topic du jour here, which is really this intersection of AI and community banking, and really how do financial institutions, community financial institutions, get their hands around harnessing the power of AI. And you've been really focusing on this topic, which is kind of foundational or fundamental, which is before you even get to a conversation about AI, it really begins by having and creating a proper data foundation. So I'm looking forward to unpacking that a little bit here today and talking a bit about creating that solid data foundation.
Yeah, great topic, and you're right. It's been at every conference, almost everywhere you look, or anything a community banking is thinking about, has AI involved, and it should. It's transformative, and just the prospects of where we can go with this are just almost endless. But having that solid foundation and thinking about a data strategy and data governance are super important. So great topic.
And I know you were just at the New Jersey Bankers Conference, where there was a whole lot of content on this. I'll supplement that with a few bits of literature that I've been looking at recently. There was a report that Jack Henry and Bank Director put out talking about this topic, and there were some metrics in there that really caught my attention. 1 in 3 bank leaders cite an inability to use data effectively as a top technical challenge. 56% of banks still keep data siloed in the systems that generate it. 41% of those of banks rely on spreadsheets to manage critical business data. There was a separate study that was published in Harvard Business Review that said 47% of newly created data records have at least one error. And then there was the last one I'll cite is a Gartner report from this summer that estimates that poor data quality costs the average enterprise $13 to $15 million a year to manage through and deal with. So those are real numbers, right? We're not talking about the periphery. We're not talking about the edge cases here. We're talking about fundamental big numbers, kind of core issues. So if I come back to your comment there that all banks and credit unions are excited about AI, right? It's all anything can talk about, understandably so and rightly so. But if you jump straight there and you overlook this critical first step of creating a strong data foundation and the data governance around that, you run some significant risks. And so really you've got to start by getting these foundational issues like inconsistent definitions or siloed data or lack of transparency up on the table, and you've got to address those before you get to those next steps. So let's start with that as the first question before we get into the best practices and kind of how you move forward. But let's go back to maybe the foundational question here of why is data governance an essential foundation for any AI strategy in a community financial institution?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to my mind, and what I think is probably the heart of the answer here, is that data quality is just number one. So a lot of the facts that you just mentioned, they all point to data quality, right, issues.
Right.
And so I think that's just the first thing I want to say, is that it's, and maybe said another way, the garbage in, garbage out. So if we're thinking about leveraging AI services, or really any use of the data, we just have to factor in the data quality. What do we have if we're training models and it's on data that's siloed, incomplete, inaccurate, not organized, those models are not going to be able to take advantage of that data. So, like, to me, that is the foundational piece, thinking about data quality and how we improve that over time. Um, and and governance is a big piece of that. It's a common language, that is used or can be used across the organization for those that have built, strong, solid data governance programs, that are part of, and I guess we should say that. I know we talked about that in a past episode, but thinking about data governance as a component of a larger data strategy. And that's what that data governance being built in, um, that's, when we think about things like data dictionaries, that creates that common language across the organization, so that, regardless of whether we're talking about frontline employees, the management team, or anyone on the technology side, they're all speaking the same language because they're using that data dictionary, that business glossary that helps them understand things like, what do we mean when we say active customer? What do we mean when we say delinquent loan? There can be different definitions across, those different teams. So just putting that framework in place that has a data dictionary as a component is what helps build that common language. So I think that's a foundational piece. And then I think last thing I would say is just, thinking about scale, like how do we scale, this and make this repeatable so we can do this over and over again. I think data governance is what, helps us with scale. So it's not just about one project or one model that we're working on. Like, if we can embed this intelligence across the institution, then we can make this repeatable, so that it can be, things, like AI services, like using them across, different teams, whether it's in customer service or risk management or lending. We've built that framework, those guardrails, if you will, so that we can plug in these new technologies, and do it in a safe way. So I think that helps us scale too. Another key component.
Common language, scalability, repeatability, all and key elements to building
Yeah.
that strong foundation. Um, you've talked in the past, and you alluded to a few of these themes here as well. The importance of complete, accurate, and organized data
Yeah.
there as well. So talk a little bit about that, if you will, and really then the best practices for unifying and aggregating data across silos, because right, yeah, that was the other word you used when you talked about incomplete, inaccurate or not
Yeah.
organized was siloed. So how do what are the best practices for breaking down those silos, but also maintaining, right, the compliance, right, that you need to have in place, because maybe not everyone should see all of that data, for example.
Yeah, no, that's great. First thing, I think about is a unified data strategy, like putting one of those into place. Thinking about, instead of kind of a patchwork or, one by one, thinking about, siloed systems or data coming together, and how do we do that? We set ahead of time. So not just at that project level, but we set ahead of time for the institution that clear vision. We need to have a single source of truth. And I think, you mentioned, those terms about, complete, accurate, organized. That's really what we're talking about when we say single source of truth, that hub of information, that everyone in the organization can rely on. And again, people can rely on it, users within the institution can, but then also other technologies. So again, as we've said, AI services or just other applications, so that we can, have again, that we've set the vision, and we have those guardrails, and now we put, data in place because we've thought through this when we've created a data strategy and not, again, just project by project. I think that's one thing. And then kind of back to the data dictionary, just the ability to leverage, a common language or a common data dictionary. And I would throw in there metadata management as well. So when I think about, data, and that data strategy, a key piece of that, yes, the data dictionary, and we've mentioned that now a couple times, but then metadata management, thinking about, making sure we've documented and the consumers of this single source of truth, our data repository, that they know where this data came from. So thinking about, the lineage, the data lineage, um, again, the definitions about that data, how frequently it's loaded, any known issues we know with a given data set. So that metadata about, our actual data, our single source of truth, is just as important. So having that in place. And then again, when you think about data strategy and especially, data governance, data stewardship, is a big piece there too. Um, so appointing data stewards in each business unit, is a key piece to a governance strategy. And so that means you have people actually looking, on a daily, weekly basis, thinking about that data quality and those standards. They're monitoring that usage of those data elements that are in that repository. Um, and it really is just making sure that we know that users in the organization know that this is data that can be trusted. So I think that, data stewards, really, that's you're adding that layer of accountability, and I think that's important and a best practice, when thinking about a data strategy. And then last thing I'll just throw in is an anecdote, from a recent conference. I asked a question about, who is dabbling or working with AI services, trying to see what value they can get from them, and these were all bankers. And literally almost every hand went up. And if I really, thought back, it probably was every hand. But then I did follow that up with a question about how many of your institutions or how many of those that raise their hand, feel like their institution has a clearly defined, data strategy and vision and data governance plan. And I got one bank out of
Wow.
that group. So I think that does speak to, what we're talking about here, that data governance is very foundational. And if we're not careful of kind of getting the cart, or if we get the cart before the horse, and you're really trying to go down the path of leveraging, new technologies like AI services, and you do that ahead of having a data strategy and a clearly defined data governance program. Um, it's dangerous, one, but then also it's most likely you're just not going to get results that are accurate or helpful. So I think, it's really thinking about, just the order of doing these things and getting some quality, governance programs and a foundation and those guardrails in place first, and then really starting to, to leverage, that data repository and get some return, for those data investments.
I'd like to pick up on you talked about return at the end there, but I'm going to go
Yeah.
back to something you talked earlier, the other side of the return coin, which is the risk side of it.
Yeah.
And you talked about metadata management, and I think you think of a conversation we were having recently, or a situation we were working through recently, where we were trying to, interpret a file of a data file, and right, by not, when we received it, we didn't receive complete information about lineage and a full explanation of what the fields were and the values were. And it turned out that the situation was that the person who had originally designed it or created it was no longer reachable,
Yeah.
and so you had the situation where there was this risk that had been injected because there was not robust metadata management. I would argue that the metadata was sitting in that person's head, and that person is now no longer available. So let's look at this for a second from the risk lens, because you talked
Yeah.
about, right, the dangers and the inaccurate or not helpful results that could come downstream, whether it's through AI or BI or reporting or insights or analytics, whatever it might be. But let's go back to this question of risk and really how you mitigate that risk, right? You talked about the data dictionary as one of those tools.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important lens here is how do you know, how does this, foundation, the strong data foundation, help reduce risk and enable, thoughtful, actionable, trustworthy analytics?
Yeah, yeah, I think first, the need to eliminate, ambiguity and inconsistency. So when you have, that data dictionary in place, I guess we've, said it a couple times in different ways, but just, the risk or that danger of coming to conclusions because you're not speaking, a common language or
Mm,
common terms. So I think that risk models, compliance reports, all those outputs, you know, we need to make sure that they have those terms have the same meaning. So a data dictionary helps do that because it's very clear. Like, okay, this is what this term means when I say, we use that example of active customer. This is what it means. It's very clear and it's consistent. It can be used consistently across the organization, and so I think that's what helps reduce regulatory compliance risk, because those regulators, they're going to expect that each financial institution can prove data lineage. Where did this come from? What is the definition that you're using in this context? And it doesn't have to, you don't have to kind of come up with those answers after the fact. You've got that in place. It's very easy to show that evidence trail, and how those definitions have been agreed upon, they're tracked, they're applied across the bank. And then again, I think a key part of that is data stewards are the individuals that are making sure that that's in place, and it's a very good piece of evidence to be able to show regulators. Um, and it really does, that's how you enable trust, in the output, whether it's reports, analytics, results of from an AI model. Um, it really is about, we need to have and users expect, they want to trust that information. So having that data dictionary in place, just builds that level of trust. Um, and that I think helps accelerate adoption of things like AI services,
right.
because you see that it's repeatable. And just like I think any typical user would, the first time or the first couple times they use a new tool, they're going to go back on their own and try to reconcile, okay, that answer that I got, or this data point I see in a report or output I see from asking an AI model a question, is that correct? And that's super important at the beginning. If they trace that back and think that that answer was incorrect, then that trust is just broken, right away. So being able to have consistency and build that trust across the user organization, is important or critical. And that's what a data dictionary and having metadata that's managed, that all feeds into that and is foundational for reducing risk.
The inverse of that situation, right? You're talking there about being able to track, data movement and lineage and being able to go and reconcile calculations and end
Yeah.
results and track that back so that you build trust. The opposite of that, I'll use a maybe a base level term and calling it a black box, but a situation where you can't see the calculation, you can't get to the data hub, you can't see the semantic model, you can't see where the data is coming from. It seems to me like that would be a red flag if I were looking for if I were licensing a tool off the shelf, if I were building something myself, if I were getting a recommendation from a friend, that I would want to make sure that I'm not working in a black box situation, because I'm not going to be able to achieve that that reconciliation, the tracking
Yeah.
the lineage and being able to get to that answer to build that level of trust. So it feels like the black box is a bit of a red flag. Is that a fair characterization?
Exactly. I think it is. It's that transparency, right? Like we want transparency. Users expect that, and the black box approach, yes, maybe it gets the same answer, but and a correct answer, but there still could be that doubt or creates ambiguity, because they can't, validate that, or they can't, reconcile that on their own. So yeah, I think being transparent, or maybe I should say having, proper governance program in place that thinks about data quality and has a data dictionary and business glossary in place. It really does give that transparency that a user needs, and that helps build that trust level. Yeah.
Right, right. Um, the configuration of the reports and the analytics that you put on top of that, right? If you can't get down to that the layer beneath that, it gets called into question.
That's right.
Let me ask this question from a slightly different direction here, which is really um, around the fact that community financial institutions have data um, sitting in their core system
Yeah.
or their general ledger. Um, why isn't that sufficient? Why isn't that the be all end all, right? Where does that why doesn't that get you all the way to the finish line?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I think the way I think about this at a very high level, or not high level, but just generally, like it makes sense to me that that's just not what core systems were designed to do. Core systems, obviously, they're transactional, operational systems. They help, run the bank every day. And transaction processing is what they're all about. So they're not analytical systems. Yes, obviously they have, reporting, built into them, operational reporting. And so, to me, thinking about, well, why don't they already support data governance in this strategy that we need? Because it's just not essential to transaction processing. So let's make sure it's optimized for transaction processing. One, I think that's a key factor, and because of that fact, so I guess it all kind of flows from there. Like they're going to be somewhat inflexible, and they're going to be it's a closed system, and they just don't have those governance capabilities for tracking lineage and what we call role-based governance and those data dictionaries, because they're processing those transactions. And I guess I would, also mention that there is important data that, for a given institution that's coming from more systems or other systems than the core,
Mm.
right? So you've got that going on too, that we've got a lot of, data, systems and data silos across the organization, and saying, that, oh, by the way, I'm gonna load data into the core system in order to have, that single source of truth. Um, it's the right idea, right? Building a central repository, a data hub, but doing it in a technology and a system that is, probably been around for quite a while, and does not have is not thought of as kind of modern data platform, type of technology, it's just going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to do that. So, um, it's a good thought, of like, hey, I want to make sure I have this all in one place, but thinking about, where, what's the location, and it's not a core operational system. It's in a system that's meant for reporting, analytics, again, building up of a central repository so that users can consume, from that central data hub, and then data can be passed to other systems as well. So I think it is just, what's the right technology, and a core system is not.
Right. And as you said, I think at the beginning of that answer, those systems are optimized for transaction processing, right?
Yeah.
That's what they're built for. This is a different use case. And so to a certain extent, right, it's a round peg square hole here, and to say, look, this is a different use case. And then I like the other dimension there, that it's not just about data from that single core or single general ledger. It's about all your other systems that the data's got to come from in order for you
Yeah.
to have that holistic picture, right? Let's close with trying to take this from the theoretical to the actual or the practical here for a second. I'm at the risk of seeming like an ambulance chaser. I'd like to come up with an example, or ask you to share an example of a
Yeah.
situation where poor data quality or lack of governance, right, or right, and an insufficiently strong foundation, or the inability to go back and hunt down lineage, right, because it's a black box. Um, how that could lead to a misleading, or right, or not helpful or inaccurate outcome when you use an AI tool to interpret and
Yeah.
evaluate some of this data. So can you give us an example for people to try and wrap their heads around?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll do two, very quick ones.
Yeah.
One is, and this is just, it's somewhat specific, but I think it could apply. Like we could kind of just use this over and over again, and that is when we're talking about feeding data to a model, for like in generative AI, where we want to be able to ask questions of our data, for example. Um, and we give it access to like everything, whether it's documents or actual data sets. Most likely we have things sitting around that aren't final versions.
Mm,
Maybe they're
right.
drafts, especially documents, when you think of whether it's standards, policies, those things, you have, 10 different drafts of that before it was finalized. And then you can, that's the document version, but then on the data set version is, I've got
Mm,
different balances for an account. I've got, data elements related to accounts and customers. And I may have brought some of that data in for a very specific purpose. And if I'm just making those data sets and those documents available to things, like a large language model, all of that is valid data for that model to use. I've made it available. And so when I'm asking questions of that model, um, I'm most likely am going to get an answer that I don't expect, because it's leveraging a data set that has some ambiguity, it has some inconsistencies and things that I'm like, oh wait, I shouldn't have shared those draft versions of those
right.
documents, or some of these calculations that I created for a very specific use case really shouldn't be fed into that model. So you've got, examples there where the AI model is returning exactly what it should, because it took into account all of that data that I gave it access to, but it really isn't the correct answer for the business situation, or a particular, the context. So again, it's that example of, I've got to be careful about what the input is, or again, thinking about a single source of truth. And if I have a data strategy that has, those data governance guardrails, I'm making those decisions ahead of time. What should be in the repository? What is an approved or a certified data set that I've thought through? Like, hey, I don't want to have certain data attributes or metrics in there because they could be confusing or I needed them for a specific purpose and they just don't apply to the broader organization. I've thought through those things and then I, allow that approved single source of truth to be the data set for our models. I'm going to get consistent answers. I'm going to get answers that I can reconcile back and say, yes, they're correct. And and then I said another example. That other example is, specifically in a data dictionary, we've talked about, active customer as a definition or as a term.
Mm,
Um, a specific example of kind of how that can go awry if I don't have that data dictionary in place is that a group, let's say the lending team defines an active customer as anyone who has opened a loan over time, right? Where the deposit team on the deposit side, it might just be a checking account that has had activity, so at least one transaction within the last 60 days. And we define that as an active customer on the deposit side. And then marketing may have a completely different definition. That's just
mm,
anyone with any product in the past 2 years, for example. So you've got three different definitions of an active customer. They all feel correct in their own context. But again,
right.
if I am making active customer data elements, if I'm allowing that to feed into a model, and the model doesn't have the context of, well, which version of that, term are you using here when I'm looking at data, I'm going to get
Right.
different answers and
Yes.
it's going to be inconsistent. So again, having that data dictionary as part of a data governance program is key to make sure that we have those standard definitions and we're speaking the same language.
You've I imagine both of those situations will resonate with our listeners. On the first front of the quality of the data going in there, separate from the consistency of definitions in your second example. On the first, we saw a situation recently where someone was training an AI tool. They loaded it up with a bunch of data, and they said, well, and maybe this is actually the the inconsistency aspects, or maybe
Yeah,
more of your second aspect, but they didn't define whether income fields were monthly or annually.
right.
And then they also didn't have a quality check to determine whether or not they had duplicate customer records in there. And so the algorithm then ran through it, and then started making some credit decisions to say, right, we're going to deny this small business a loan, or we're going
Yeah,
to overextend an approval to someone else, because you have these, these inputs here that are, 12x or 1/12 of one another in the annual versus monthly data situation, and it threw things, completely out of whack. So, look, then you put yourself in a position where, as a financial institution, you're potentially going to be exposed to rising, loan defaults,
yeah,
or right, certainly if a regulator comes in, they're gonna not be happy, is the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you're going to get a fine or something worse than that. And then, the downstream reputational damage and the loss of customer trust, all those things which within an ERM model you kind of put under some of those, qualitative categories, but
yeah,
all real impact. So, seemingly something that could be easily checked up front to say, well, is this value monthly or annual? And validate that versus something in a credit report, or another third party data source. Check on your customer records to have a unique identifier and see, right, do each of these have a unique identifier. Certainly there are governance steps that could have been applied there, that you could have caught that stuff up front, and then all of those downstream implications would have been mitigated. So I think that you're right on there, that these are real problems. They're not
yeah,
theoretical. They're ones that people are actually encountering. Some of them are hard to solve. some of them are maybe not quite hard. It just does require you, as you said, kind of up front, is you've got to have that, that governance strategy. You've got to have a unified data strategy. You've got to have a metadata management program, data stewardship, right? All of those things, you put those in place, and then you get the downstream benefit of, these AI enabled and, AI services that you can use to power the business.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, or maybe to just said another way, that I think every institution is still thinking through AI governance, right? Like
Right.
that's a tough, that I have not heard one institution that says, we're past that. We're, have all kinds of different AI services, in production, interacting with sensitive PII data across the organization, and just rolled out those services. Everyone is thinking through, like, what's the best strategy for our bank, and so the I guess my thought there is, like, that needs to be figured out, obviously, but in the meantime, foundational pieces, foundational, part of that AI governance or that AI strategy is data governance, as part of an overall data strategy for the organization. So thinking through that and then implementing, and actually getting those building blocks in place first, so that we can, each institution can kind of work through those challenges that we've talked about here and others. But it's really at the data layer first, and creating that central repository, that data hub of a single source of truth, and having governance around it, and then in parallel thinking about, the AI strategy and the AI governance, and again, data and data governance being a key piece of that strategy as well. Yeah.
Jeff, thank you. I think that you
Yeah.
encapsulate that beautifully there. That AI governance. We just had Beth Nillis on the program talking about that, and we were
Excellent.
talking about, right, program risk assessments and risk and control self-assessments as two of the tools in the
Yeah.
tool belt to be able to think about AI governance and AI policy and AI practices. But it begins, as you said, right, with the creating the proper foundation, right? The data governance as part of that overall data strategy, right? Making sure that you're not building a black box, you're not running
Yeah.
a black box, you're not engaging a partner that has a black box,
That's right.
that you have the ability to track lineage, reconcile, build trust, all really important steps on this, under this umbrella of creating a proper data foundation. So thank you very much for the thoughts. We appreciate it. Hopefully we've left folks here with some thoughtful nuggets and some important topics to chew on. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.